Thanks everyone for coming. My job here is just to introduce Bruce. And so Bruce is an experienced board member, chair, and executive leader. He has led across a broad range of sectors, including capability development, engineering, logistics, management, HR, sport, military, and the public sector. So he has played multiple leadership roles, including the regional manager and group controller of the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office. And he has since jumped from the practitioner to researcher divide and is now completing his PhD with Massey University on the topic of leadership in extreme contexts. I'm sure we'll hear something quite interesting today from Bruce. And so Bruce, you can take it away.
Please excuse me. I've never given one of these Zoom presentations before, so I feel a little bit like a caged hen, whereas I prefer to be a sort of a barn chook. But here we go anyway. Those of you who know me know that I was in the military for a number of years and also part of emergency management. So it seems like a bit of a strange way of doing business, of having been something to then turn around and try and learn something more about it. But there are a number of things that we did as a practitioner that we learned from osmosis, and there must be more to it, which is part of my motivation for getting involved on the research side. So if you have a look at leadership in extreme contexts, and while that's the topic of my research, regrettably, I've only got about half an hour, so we can only deal with a small part of it. What really surprised me was that there's a need for more research in this particular area, and yet it seems to be one of the least researched areas of leadership. And aside from the disaster itself, and we've seen it across the news, the next major source of criticism is leadership. Most research in this subject, and there's an awful lot on leadership, focuses on internal things. So of leadership, and there's an awful lot written about it, leadership in extreme contexts is a very, very small sector of that subset. And if we take that a little bit further, then the leadership component of leadership in extreme contexts is even smaller again. See, most people seem to focus on the event itself and not the leadership, which is the purpose of my research. And where we do have some research on there, most of it talks about one person, the leader, and yet there's more to it than one person. You could also regard that person as a target, because unfortunately for most people involved in emergency management, if you do a really good job, then nobody will remember you, and if you do a crap job, then you're a front page news. So where do you start? So what I did is I went into scholarship. I did quite an extensive literature review. The little slide there that says about Amazon, if you dial up leadership in Amazon, you'll find that there are over 60,000 books on the subject. So there's a huge amount of articles, books. And what I did is went in and I chose 61 different concepts and theories to try and assist me in understanding leadership in extreme contexts a little bit more. I went in and, you know, that's only the tip of the iceberg, basically, those 61 theories and concepts. But what I couldn't find was something that was applicable in all cases. So people talked about charismatic leadership, and they talked about transformational leadership and transactional leadership and servant leader relationships and all those sorts of things. And I couldn't find a common thread right through the whole thing. And so it was quite comforting to find that those people who had preceded me also came to that conclusion. So little consensus in literature about the most effective leadership style with respect to followers. So that is quite significant. So I then went, well, if scholarship isn't going to help me too much here, what about practice? And so over recent decades, there have been a number of very interesting books, some of them put out by Jim Collins. There's one there by Tom Peters and others. And the concept is if something's replicable, then let's have a look at what truly great leaders are doing, and let's try and replicate that. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. See, if you are a great painter, you don't learn to paint by getting a picture that's a paint by numbers there. You have a look at all the great painters. They're all completely different. And you know, they don't try and copy each other's style. They have their own individual style. And maybe that is I guess, a pointer for the way we should be approaching leadership. And one of the challenges associated with those books by Peters and Collins and others is that we're bound up by the halo effect. So if you take a look at what these people have done and try and replicate it, then it isn't going to work particularly well. And a great way of trying to explain this, I suppose, is, and I can't really do it in this setting here, but when I'm and got an audience in front of me, I ask them to stand up. And what I talk about, this is an evidence base on who's going to be successful in perhaps the next 5 years. And so I get everybody to stand up. And then I say, those people who are smaller than the average person, sit down. Those who are heavier than the average person, sit down. If you've had no leadership experience in your early life, then sit down, i.e. if you weren't a leader in the Cub Scouts or Girl Guides or something like that. If you're less intelligent than the average person, sit down. Less confident, not as good looking, those people need to sit down. If you're prone to emotional outbursts, then sit down. If you're wearing or have worn glasses, then sit down. And those of you who have blonde hair or used to have blonde hair, sit down. And then the real crunch is I ask females to sit down, and that starts to bring everybody on edge a little bit. Now, that is an evidence-based example of how some organisations produce leaders. And the organisation I'm talking about is actually the US Army, dating back in the 1940s. So yes, it might be evidence-based, but it doesn't mean that it captures all the people and all the qualities associated with leadership. So it's no good going for the halo effect or trying to look back, because that's been found to be flawed in the past. And one very interesting bit of scholarship is a study of Fortune 500's most admired companies over a 20-year period indicated that those with the worst ratings went on to earn much higher stock than those with the most admired firms. So if it works for a firm, what about a person? Because if you actually have a look at some of the characteristics of great leaders, you know, flexible, structured, decisive, when they turn to the bad side, the dark side, those things can mean something completely different. So flexible can also mean confused. Structured could mean rigid. You know, innovative means that they clutch at straws. Outspoken means that they're opinionated. And so you can start to see that the same characteristics aren't always of high quality in all circumstances. There's a very interesting bit of scholarship, book written by Kurana. And he looked at 850 chief executives. He wrote a book that's saying, look, stop searching for the corporate savior, you know, the great redeemer who's going to come in and sort your place out, because they don't exist. And an awful lot of instances where people have headhunted successful people in one setting, and they've turned out to be dead ducks in another setting. And if you have a look at those stats there, you'll find that quite a small percentage, an awful lot less than 100% of success comes down to the chief executive. So, you know, only 35 to 60% is caused by internal factors. And of those internal factors, only one of those is the chief executive. There's another very interesting book written by Schumacher, and what he says, his book was on profiting from uncertainty, and he pretty much said that only 55% of success is attributable to internal factors, and only 1/3 of that 55% can be attributed to the chief executive from people at that level. So if the chief executive is not that all-powerful when it comes to success, and even the chief executive and their staff, only make up 55%, then you really got to look at context as a part of the overall equation. Now, I read a very interesting book by Nesbitt, and he was basically saying that there's a big difference between Eastern and Western cultures. In Eastern cultures, you tend to view things as a wider system, whereas in Western culture, we have a way of determining things in terms of, we have a rules-based society, and through rules, we can understand cause and effect. And that's why, you look at the Chinese and they have things like feng shui, a system of energy, the way we organize our lives and our homes and things like that. Whereas in the West, we have things, rule-based society. So we have rules like I before E, except after C. And yet we all know there are exceptions to that rule. So maybe we're looking at these things completely the wrong way, and we should be widening it and taking a look at what other cultures have got to say about the subject. And so what I said to myself is that maybe we shouldn't be looking at one person as leadership, we should be looking at a system. And so what I started doing was trying to work out, well, what's in the system? So I've interviewed a number of people, and the page you've got in front of you looks like an absolute dog's breakfast. And you can start to understand how difficult things are and why they go wrong, because there's so many pressure points there that can lead to failure, and not very much there that can guarantee success. So if you have a look at this thing, you'll see that context is quite important, and there's different types of context. There's direct, indirect, perceived, combination of all those things. You have a situation which is dynamic across time, so there's pre-event, during event, and post-event. And below that, I've got this term meta-governance, or governance of governance, and I guess this started in the 1980s, when the government stopped being a provider of service and became a procurer of service. And so you had a degree of fragmentation. Different people were doing different things. And so there was a need to have governance organizations which actually managed the individual organizations. And then there was a need for meta-governance at the national level to provide governance on that governance. So if you look in the middle there, you'll see that maybe there's a lead agency in an event, and it comprises a number of things in the system. You have a leader, with a controller, you have staff with a staff system in there, you have a governance body, there's a management system, culture, values, rules of engagement. And alongside of them, you have partner organisations. What's really interesting is that some of those partner organisations have different rules of engagement. Now, a good example of that is Pike River mine, when the miners said, right, we're going in to the mine, and the police said, no, we're not. Now, that's not a criticism of the police, but that's just an example of how organisations have different rules of engagement. And in order to be effective, you need to have integration of all those organisations to make it successful. And yet we don't have integration. We actually have silos going right the way through. If we had integration, then you would have those silos coming together, supporting one person managing an entity. If you have a look at the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act, in particular the management plan dated, I think it's 2015, which actually supports that, you have a look at all the different partner agencies, and they sign up to different responsibilities. So one, and I won't mention which they are because it doesn't matter that much. One says that they'll be responsible to the controller, they'll be located in the emergency operations centre, they'll maintain communications throughout, they'll support the controller, and they'll advise the controller. Another one of those entities says they'll do nothing, pretty much. Another one says they'll provide some liaison and they can assign some units. Another one says that it'll exchange situation reports and provide liaison when requested. And so you can start to see, people are supporting the same event at different levels, and they're not matched. Look down below there and you can sort of see some of the other major players. There's the media and the public, and you can segment those quite considerably. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm not going to today. So I started looking elsewhere as to find if scholarships have not much help, i.e. leadership theory is not much help because it doesn't cater in a very dynamic environment, then what does? And it's amazing when you do research, you think you have a systematic way of trying to find out things, and you realise that in actual fact, some of the best ideas, you stumble across them quite by chance. And this is one, this is a picture, my picture actually, it's not how he did it, this is Aristotle's rhetoric. And back in ancient Greece days, what they had was, it was almost like a game of competition, oratory. And so you had the concepts of ethos, logos, and pathos. So if you were a speaker, in order to be effective, needed to establish their credentials. And they could do that through a number of ways. They could establish it through mastery of their subject. They could establish it through being a really good character and great reputation, or they could exhibit goodwill towards the people, those sorts of things. The argument itself was a factor of logic or reasoning, and often the strength could be enhanced by having inductive or deductive reasoning. And then it wasn't simply a case of the speaker and the argument, but it was the mood of the people as well. So you could have a great speaker and with a convincing argument, but if the orator wasn't in harmony with the value set of the audience, then it didn't work. So you had those three things, and there was a couple other factors in there that Aristotle talked about, although it's on the fringes. One was telos, which is purpose, because we all must have a purpose. One which was quite interesting is kairos in there, which is, if you get the right speaker with the right argument and the receptive audience, then you're going to have optimal conditions for something. And the other important thing there is this thing called context. So what I started looking at is and there was one very good explanation about leadership, and it said that leadership involves personal characteristics of the leaders, interaction between leader and follower, and situational pressures. So I actually adapted my Aristotle model and said, well, maybe these are factors in leadership that we should be looking at. And so we would produce a model for leadership rather than a theory. So if you have a look at leadership, it's really important to understand that there's different types of systems that you're working with. One is called operational functions, and it's a bit like a bicycle, and you can pull a bike to bits and you can put it back together and you can make it better, and there's no ill effect to that bicycle. There's another sort of system which relies on context and purpose, and one of those is it's a bit like a frog. Now you can pull a leg off a frog and it won't die, but it's not going to be any better by the time because you can't reattach that thing. So there's a lot of people, and this is really applicable in change management. And when you think about it, leadership in extreme context is a little bit like change management. So the problem with leading in those sorts of situations is you can play around with something and you can't put it back. You'll destroy a system if you take it out of its context or its environment. Now, I haven't, I'm only so far through my my research at the moment and trying to understand what the capabilities of a leader are. I've started formulating a few ideas here that I've derived from talking to people. And what I'm not doing is just talking to operational leaders. It's really important that I talk to members of the public, that I talk to operational leaders, that I talk to the media, all those sort of things to get a 360 view of what this person should look like. So there's a couple of interesting ones there. One is own it. Now that's really interesting. We saw a great example of how not to own it when the bushfire situation over in Australia was, and the Prime Minister was on a holiday over in Hawaii. That was a good example of not owning it, and something a little bit closer to home when the New Zealand cricket team were doing particularly poorly, and the coach decided that he was off on holiday with his family. Now, going on holiday with a family is really important, and it might have been planned 6 months ago, but it was a great example of not owning a problem. You can have a look at some of the others there. I could talk about those, but I've got to move on. And one thing that's really important to understand is that each of those things, it shouldn't be prescriptive. How you do that can differ, and it differs depending on the audience and your own attributes. So it's really important to have some drive in an extreme context. But my research would indicate that some people get their drive from their passion for what it is they do. Some people have a sense of duty. I asked one person actually, and she said, well, Bruce, I come from a family of stoics. Other people have high energy, and it's the same with communication. You know, not all people are gifted communicators, but they can still be effective depending on, you know, their skills and also what the audience is looking for. So some people get it through being authentic. Some people get it from being authoritative. So it's a little bit like that ethos section of Aristotle's rhetoric. One of the things that I found really interesting, having been a practitioner in this area, was that you know, there was a mismatch between what some of the early scholars were saying. Some of the early scholarship in this area indicated that what happens in an emergency like this is that people develop a couple of situations and they do an evaluation of the options and they say, right, this is what we're going to do. And so there's a very interesting bit of research by Gary Klein, who went out with fire people over in the US. And what they found is they might have had all that scholarship that they had in the background, but they found that nobody ever developed any options. The person went straight for what they decided to do. And so they developed this concept called recognition prime decision making. And so you can sort of see from the slide there that you know, it relies on people having experience and I guess interpolating between the dots basically, and coming up with the most plausible outcome and a course of action to actually implement it. What's really important also is the fact that leaders need to understand that they're going to be clouded by cognitive biases. In my own case, there's one right up in the high left corner there called anchoring bias. You know, in 2013, we had a series of earthquakes here in Wellington, and they were 6.6, 6.5. And when QuakeCoRE hit, it was initially recorded as a 6.5. And so the tendency is to think, well, actually, I've been in this situation before. It's going to be like it was back in 2013, but it wasn't. There's a couple of interesting slides here. This is one produced by a chap called Snowden, who developed it. He's not an academic at all. He worked for IBM. And his model, very simple model here, is you simple, complicated, complex, chaotic situations. And in a chaotic situation, it's completely novel. Nobody has any idea what it is they're being faced with. And so in that case, you've got to act, and you've got to sense, evaluate that act, and then respond accordingly. And that's different from, say, just a complicated one, which is you've got to sense what's happening, analyze that, and then respond, those sorts of things. So through scholarship, there's quite a few, you know, really interesting models. So that's a little bit about leadership, a little bit about means of engagement. There's a very good bit of scholarship by a chap called Stephen Bungay, and not everybody agrees with him, but it's quite insightful actually, having been in a situation where I've been in a command position, a leadership position, a management position. And what he's saying is, command is not on the coercive side of leadership. Command is something completely different. And what's more, he's saying that command exists out there in the environment outside the military. It exists in business. And so you have these three things. If you have a look at the leadership one, you'll see that that's based on Adair's leadership, action-centered leadership. So he's based his whole model on that, basically. And what he's saying is that command is different from leadership, which is different from management. And I went through it and I said, well, in actual fact, there's something more to it there. There's a thing called governance as well. And so I looked at all four. And if you actually have a look at it, they exist for different purposes. So governance, the components of that is you manage the purpose side, you hold people to account, and you manage effective compliance. Command is not like leadership. Gandhi was a leader, but he wasn't a commander. Nehru was the commander over there, or the executive person. So command is about managing an organization. And when you're given responsibility for an organization, you're responsible for developing strategy, giving direction, and building that organization. Leadership's something different. It's about defining and achieving tasks. It's about maintaining and building teams. It's about developing individuals. And management's something completely different. This is about organizing, controlling resources. And what's really interesting is to have an effective outcome, you need components of all four of those things. So you can't do it. You can't lead your way through absolutely everything. There's a management component. There's an executive component. There's a governance component. So, I've got purpose up there. So we manage that through the governance side. So governance defines the purpose. It appoints a chief executive or a commander and then holds them to account. Context is really interesting. If context is so important, then there's been very little research about it. One in particular that was particularly good, I thought, was led by a chap called Sean Hanna. And what they did is they developed this model here. And the model's basically saying that, okay, there's dimensions to this extreme context, and they actually defined it. So this is a situation where leadership influences the context and context influences the leadership. So you have almost a symbiotic relationship. There's high risk of physical, physiological and material consequences. And there's things present that are not present in BAU. So what they did is they broke down the dimensions of the context, and they said you can make it better by applying attenuators, and you can, I guess, the context can make things more difficult for the leader through intensifiers. And so what I did is looked at two case studies. One is the impact of QuakeCoRE in Wellington. The other one was COVID-19. And had a look at the differences in attenuators and intensifiers there. Now, some of them are the same. You can attenuate the situation by applying strategy and all those sorts of things. Some of them are a little bit different. Here's serendipity down there. We got lucky. That's really interesting. If you have a look at some of the intensifiers there, time, complexity, those sorts of things are really quite important. And so through those attenuators and intensifiers, you come to understand a little bit more about the role of the people in leadership positions. Just going back to that model there, while I found that Hanna model particularly useful, it was missing one thing. And it's all very well about talking about leadership and context and the message and all those sorts of things if you don't consider the people. And people are very difficult to categorize, but through scholarship, there's a few really interesting tools out there that help people understand people a little bit more. Certainly, I've been introduced to the power of the 2x2 matrix. And if you have a look at what some of the others have been doing, there's a sociologist called Mary Douglas that said you can categorize people in terms of their adherence to rules and their adherence to being in a group. And so you can divide people up into different categories there. So depending on what the situation is, if it's climate change, then at the far right, upper right, you have hierarchists. And these are, we need more rules, get a disciplinary in charge, and let's enforce the Kyoto protocols. At the top left, you have fatalists, that this is all too big, people are selfish, it's all too hard, we're doomed, sort of thing. And you can work your way through the needs of individualists and those who subscribe to egalitarian type principles. And so if you take what Douglas has done, you can sort of understand that you don't have to satisfy the needs of the majority. What you have to do is actually satisfy the needs of all the people. And so you need to segment them. You can do that using a number of other things, in post-crisis recovery. Some people like change, some people like stability, some people have a strong sense of community, some people are very individualistic. And so you need to meet the needs of all those people. So just to wrap up what it is I've been trying to do, what we don't need is another theory on leadership, but some models, useful models would be particularly useful. And so this particular thing, I'll call it a leadership engine. It doesn't matter what it's called, but it's taken what Hannah has produced and produced it in something that gives a better indication that if you get that leadership right, you get your means of engagement and you get those gears going, you energize the people, that you've got a good chance of achieving the purpose. At the same time, what you're trying to do is manage the impact of the context, and you do that through intensifiers and attenuators. All right, okay, that's 30 minutes. I'd be very happy to accept questions if there's anybody left online. So we'll stop there.
Hi, Bruce, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, I'll just get started. So I really enjoyed your presentation. So yeah, one of the things I had in mind was if you have to stress test your functional model of leadership, which you came up towards the end, just as a trial run or something like that. And I'm just curious about failures, right? The role of failures of particular incident or something like that. Is that a good indicator of the leadership, the functional leadership diagram which you created? Do people learn from failures, or how do you really stress test a good framework? Thank you.
Well, I think people understand, those of us who have failed in our lives, and that probably goes for all of us, I suppose, understand that you learn an awful lot more from failures, although you have to understand what it is that you've learnt. And a good question, a good example of that is in the situation where we had the QuakeCoRE series of events as they impacted on Wellington here. We got a degree of criticism, some of it by academics based out of Christchurch, saying, didn't you learn from Christchurch? And the answer was, yes, we did, but this wasn't Christchurch. It was totally different. The earthquake manifested itself in different ways. We also were dealing with a storm, a tornado, floods, and all those things. They were different from Christchurch. In Christchurch, you had an epicenter of damage. In Wellington, we had little pockets of damage, and some of it was 15 miles north of the CBD. So shutting down the CBD wasn't a solution. Those sorts of things. One of the other things that's really important, and it comes back to one of my slides, but I didn't really talk about in any depth, and it's about managing risk and opportunity. Now, a very simple example is in COVID-19 is that you have on one side, you have the health issues, and on the other side, you have the economic issues. Okay, so you've got to have a balance, and you've got to manage risk and opportunity. Too often we just manage risk, but we don't manage opportunity. One aspect of my research is can we leverage off these unfortunate circumstances to thrive, not just survive? And if you go back to situations where you manage risk and opportunity. There's some very good examples in Gary Klein's book, actually, and it talks about military examples in a combat situation. We can all recall a few years ago of, I can't think of its name now, there was a cruiser off the coast of the Iranian Gulf, and it shot down an Airbus. And the commanding officer was sacked, basically, and what a terrible thing this was. But when you actually have a look at the context and look, and they had been managing those situations not only on a daily basis, but several times a day, things coming at them. Is it a missile or is it an aircraft? Is the aircraft a commercial aircraft or a military aircraft? And so you're putting somebody in a situation, an intolerable situation almost, for which there's no easy answer. They're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, sort of thing. And it's a little bit like sport, okay? Over in the US, they play baseball, and it's a very popular sport, but we don't play it once a week. They play it several times a week. So even a most successful team, the most successful team over there loses a number of games. But in that situation of the commanding officer in that cruiser, he can't afford to lose one game. Okay, so if he loses, he's shot down an airliner, or he's been hit by a missile. And so in those situations, it's really difficult trying to manage those conflicting tensions and walk that tightrope of acceptability, meeting the needs of everybody. Sorry, it's a very long answer, but it's quite a complicated matter that you're referring to.
Thanks, Bruce.
Cheers.
Hi, Bruce. I have to off shortly, unfortunately, but I'll throw a question at you. You said you focused on leadership and obviously and the way that leadership works, but what happens when you get somebody who isn't up to the task? And therefore, so what role is there for setting up the framework and the legal structures to ensure that the leader can make guided to make the correct decisions, even if they're not the individual maybe that is best suited to undertake it?
Yeah, in all systems there needs to be checks and balances, and this is where the governance side comes in, but it's also where you have a command or a control structure. So in an emergency, say here in New Zealand, you have a local controller, and that person is empowered to manage things at the local level because it's best managed at the local level. You have a group controller, and then you have a national controller. But as you go up higher, you have the responsibility to make sure that things being dealt with appropriate at that level. So if you're, say, the national controller and you're unhappy with what's occurring at the group level, then you need to sort of have that conversation. Now that's different from, really interesting in QuakeCoRE. There was hardly a day went by where somebody didn't come in and say that so-and-so had, had thrown me under a bus, basically, and that included the minister and a few others. And what always amazes you when you're running an operation is how people can make such bold statements when they don't understand the context and they've never been to any of the meetings around developing strategy. I don't know any leader who's a better leader for the fact that they get kicked while they're in the middle of an operation like that. But having said that, you have to manage those sorts of things. I've had a situation where I would say due to personal resilience or lack of, I've had to remove people from rosters. It's not that they weren't good people, they just weren't suited for that role, and we reallocated them to a different role. So this comes back to owning it and also making sure you get a good outcome, but it doesn't mean you have to micromanage it. Now, I'm not sure whether I've answered your question. Certainly have another crack at me if you think I've skipped around it.
No, it's fine. I think it's a really complex issue of how you balance that the structure, and then the individual. I have to dash off anyway, but thanks for the presentation, Bruce.
Thanks for your time, John. All right. Well, thanks very much for your time. I hope you gained something from that. Certainly, I'm only halfway through my research. Got awful lot more to do. And it's one of those situations where the more you know, the more you realise you don't know. And it's quite interesting that you can have a career on something and come to the end of it and realise that you actually knew very little about the whole thing. All right, maybe I'll have another crack in 18 months' time, and we can update you on where I've got to. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Bruce.